Welcome to Time in History. I'm Professor Bill. Some photographs were never meant to be seen. Not because they were false, but because they were too real. Governments can control headlines. They can control narratives. But controlling images is harder. Tonight we look at the photographs they tried to hide. Look closely. When the bomb fell on Hiroshima, the world saw the mushroom cloud. What it did not see were the bodies in the streets. U.S. occupation authorities restricted photographs of burn victims and radiation sickness. For years, those images were locked away. The official narrative spoke of ending a war. The photographs, when finally released, showed what ending really looked like. The flag over Iwo Jima became a symbol of triumph. But dozens of other photographs from that same island were held back. Dead Marines, burned bodies, panic under fire. Editors were told what to print. The public saw heroism. The archive recorded horror. In the 1930s, government photographers documented starvation, eviction, children without shoes. But not every frame was meant for newspapers. Some images were considered too destabilizing during fragile recovery. America was rebuilding its confidence. Confidence doesn't grow well beside photographs of despair. In 1968, U.S. troops killed hundreds of civilians in My Lai. Army reports minimized it. The war machine kept moving. But a photographer's images told a different story. When they were finally published, they ignited outrage across America. Sometimes, a single photograph can break a carefully built silence. After the Chernobyl explosion, the first official reports called it contained. Photographs of radiation burns and abandoned streets were tightly controlled. The world learned the truth slowly, through fragments, leaks, foreign satellites. Governments don't always lie with words. Sometimes, they lie by withholding images. In June 1989, the world watched tanks roll into Tiananmen Square. For a brief moment, one image slipped through. A lone man standing in front of a column of armored vehicles. The photograph circled the globe. Inside China, it vanished. Censorship erased it from textbooks, search engines, and public memory. The protest itself was reframed as necessary stabilization. But the image survived abroad, proof that history can be suppressed domestically while remaining immortal elsewhere. A government can silence witnesses. It cannot fully silence a photograph once it escapes. In 2004, images from Abu Ghraib prison leaked to the press. Hooded prisoners, human pyramids, smiling guards. For months, the public narrative of the Iraq War emphasized liberation and democracy. The photographs contradicted that story instantly. Officials called them isolated incidents. But the damage was done. The images spread faster than any official statement. They reshaped global opinion. Sometimes, censorship fails, not because authorities don't try, but because someone inside decides the world must see. During the famine in Soviet Ukraine in 1932 to 1933, foreign journalists were restricted, and photography was tightly controlled. Millions starved. Official reports minimized the catastrophe or denied it outright. Some images were smuggled out. Others were buried in archives for decades. The absence of photographs became part of the strategy. If suffering is not seen, it becomes easier to dispute. But even limited visual evidence later forced historians to confront what words alone could not fully convey. On May 4, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on students at Kent State University. 4 were killed. The most famous image, a young woman screaming over a fallen body, shattered the official tone of order and control. Authorities initially framed the protest as violent and threatening. The photograph suggested something far more tragic. It became impossible to describe the event without confronting that single frame. A government statement can be revised. A photograph cannot. In December 1984, a gas leak in Bhopal killed thousands within days. Early corporate and governmental statements downplayed the scale. But photographs of children, of entire neighborhoods lying still, forced international attention. Some images were restricted locally and delayed in circulation. Yet, once they appeared globally, denial collapsed. The disaster was no longer abstract statistics. It had faces. And once a catastrophe has a face, it becomes harder to bury. In 1915, as Armenians were deported and massacred across the Ottoman Empire, photography became dangerous. Foreign observers were limited. Images were confiscated. Some were smuggled out by missionaries and diplomats. Others disappeared entirely. For decades, official narratives denied systematic extermination. Yet the surviving photographs, skeletal refugees, forced marches, abandoned villages, stood as visual testimony. When governments debate terminology, photographs speak in silence. They do not argue. They show. At the turn of the 20th century, photographs from the Congo Free State exposed mutilations carried out under King Leopold II's regime. Hands severed, villages destroyed. These images were never meant for European newspapers. Activists like Alice Seeley Harris used them as evidence, projecting them in public lectures. Belgium initially resisted the narrative, but the photographs traveled. They became proof that colonial civilization carried a hidden brutality. Without those images, the atrocities might have remained distant rumors. During the Spanish Civil War, images of bombed civilians and executions circulated internationally. Some were banned locally, others manipulated for propaganda. Governments on both sides understood the power of the camera. A single frame could sway foreign sympathy. Robert Capa's photographs made the war human, and therefore impossible to reduce to ideology alone. Control of territory mattered, but control of images mattered just as much. On January 30th, 1972, British soldiers shot unarmed civil rights protesters in Derry. Initial official statements described gunmen among the crowd. Photographs contradicted that claim. Images of wounded civilians being carried through smoke spread internationally. The power of those frames fueled decades of investigation and controversy. Words attempted to contain the narrative. The photographs refused containment. For years, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, photographs of flag-draped coffins arriving at Dover Air Force Base were restricted. The policy was framed as respect for families. Critics argued it also shielded the public from the visible cost of war. When restrictions eased, the images were solemn. Rows of coffins, silent honor guards, no speeches. War is often presented through strategy and rhetoric. Coffins changed the conversation. In 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi. His mother insisted on an open casket funeral. Photographs of his mutilated face were published in black newspapers and later nationally. Many outlets considered the images too disturbing. But suppression would have meant silence. The photographs exposed racial violence that officials often minimized. They ignited outrage and helped galvanize the civil rights movement. Sometimes, the most uncomfortable images are the ones history most needs. After Nagasaki, many Japanese photographs documenting radiation sickness were confiscated by occupation forces. Film reels were taken. Prints were restricted. The world saw destruction from the sky. It did not immediately see the slow deaths that followed. Leukemia. Burns that never healed. Censorship was not about denying the explosion. It was about controlling the aftermath. In 1960, South African police opened fire on peaceful protesters in Sharpeville. 69 people were killed. The government framed it as crowd control. Photographs told a different story. Bodies lying face down, shot while fleeing. Authorities attempted to control distribution, but the images crossed borders. They exposed apartheid's violence to the world and intensified international sanctions. Once seen, they could not be unseen. When Guernica was bombed in 1937, the attack targeted civilians. Initial reports downplayed responsibility. Photographs of shattered homes and burned bodies contradicted official claims. They traveled through Europe, fueling outrage. Attempts were made to discredit the images as exaggerations. But rubble does not exaggerate. Fire does not exaggerate. The camera documented what politics tried to dilute. When American forces entered Buchenwald in April 1945, they brought cameras. The images they captured were almost too horrific to publish. Emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses, children behind barbed wire. Some editors questioned whether the public could handle it. But military officials insisted the photographs be shown. Not as propaganda, but as proof. The Nazi regime had tried to destroy records and evidence. These photographs became undeniable testimony. In this case, the camera defeated erasure. In 1943, millions starved in Bengal under British colonial rule. Wartime censorship limited reporting. Photographs of skeletal children and bodies on Calcutta streets circulated slowly and often outside official channels. The empire framed the crisis as logistical failure. The images suggested neglect and policy decisions that worsened the disaster. Censorship did not erase the famine. It delayed accountability. For 40 years, the U.S. Public Health Service studied untreated syphilis in black men in Tuskegee, Alabama. Participants were never fully informed. Photographs existed, medical exams, group portraits, official documentation. The story remained buried until a whistleblower exposed it in 1972. When the images resurfaced, they revealed not violence with weapons, but violence through neglect. Censorship can protect institutions for decades, until evidence surfaces. When the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory burned in 1911, 146 workers died, many of them young immigrant women. Early corporate narratives emphasized accident. Photographs showed locked doors, bodies on sidewalks, firefighters unable to reach upper floors. The images fueled labor reform movements. They contradicted attempts to minimize responsibility. Industrial progress looked different through the lens of catastrophe. Under the Khmer Rouge, thousands were photographed at Tuol Sleng prison before execution. The regime documented its victims meticulously, then tried to erase them. When the prison was discovered in 1979, the mugshots remained. Faces staring directly into the camera. Ordinary expressions, ordinary clothes. The regime fell. The photographs survived. They became silent witnesses in courtrooms decades later. On June 16, 1976, South African police opened fire on students protesting apartheid education laws in Soweto. One photograph, Hector Peterson's lifeless body carried through the streets, traveled worldwide. The apartheid government attempted to control media coverage and restrict distribution. But the image crossed borders. It exposed the brutality of the regime more clearly than any speech or policy paper ever could. In 1943, during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Nazi forces documented their own suppression campaign. The infamous photograph of a young boy with raised hands appeared in the Stroop Report, originally intended as internal proof of order restored. It was never meant for public sympathy. Decades later, it became one of the defining images of the Holocaust. A photograph created for domination transformed into evidence against its creators. In September 1971, inmates at Attica Prison in New York rebelled over brutal conditions. When state forces retook the prison, 43 people were dead. Initial official statements claimed inmates had killed hostages. Photographs and forensic evidence later contradicted that narrative. Images from inside the yard, bodies lying in mud, wounded prisoners, revealed a far more violent retaking than authorities first admitted. When Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005, official briefings initially emphasized control and coordination. Photographs from New Orleans told another story. Thousands stranded at the Superdome, families trapped on rooftops, elderly residents abandoned in hospitals. Some officials criticized what they called sensational coverage, but the images forced national scrutiny. Disaster management could no longer be framed as efficient when the camera showed otherwise. In 1973, members of the American Indian Movement occupied Wounded Knee, citing broken treaties and systemic abuse. The standoff lasted 71 days. Federal authorities tightly controlled access. Photographs that emerged showed armed blockades, destroyed property, and a community under siege. Competing narratives framed the occupation as rebellion or resistance. The images revealed a confrontation rooted in decades of unresolved history. In August 1968, Soviet tanks entered Prague to crush reform. State media framed it as brotherly assistance. Photographs showed civilians standing in front of tanks, arguing with soldiers, climbing onto armored vehicles. These images contradicted the narrative of consent. Some were suppressed in Eastern Bloc countries for decades. But the camera captured something ideology could not control: visible resistance. During the 1979 Iranian Revolution, competing narratives fought for dominance. Images of mass demonstrations, burning portraits of the Shah, and later the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis reshaped global perception. Both the collapsing monarchy and the emerging regime sought to control which photographs defined the moment. But once distributed internationally, those images became the revolution's permanent face. In 1994, nearly 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda in just 100 days. Early international reporting was hesitant. Some governments avoided the term genocide. Photographs of mass graves and fleeing civilians forced recognition. The delay in response remains one of the most debated failures of modern diplomacy. Images accelerated what language resisted. In July 1995, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed in Srebrenica. Initial confusion obscured the scale. Satellite imagery and later forensic photography exposed mass graves. Denial persisted for years. The photographs became courtroom evidence at international tribunals. Visual proof dismantled political denial. Funeral photographs from Sharpeville intensified global outrage. Authorities attempted to manage narrative impact by limiting local press. But international circulation ensured the massacre could not be contained within borders. When the massacre at My Lai became public in 1969, it was not official reports that shifted opinion. It was photographs. Images of civilians lying in a ditch, entire families executed, contradicted months of sanitized military briefings. Attempts were made to frame the event as an anomaly, but the camera showed scale. It showed repetition. It showed intention. Once published, the images fractured domestic support for the war in a way statistics never could. During the Holodomor, foreign journalists were escorted on carefully controlled routes. Photography inside affected regions was restricted. Smuggled images revealed skeletal villagers and deserted farms. Official Soviet narratives denied famine. The scarcity of photographs became part of the denial strategy. When archives later opened, the few surviving images carried disproportionate weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they existed at all. When the Berlin Wall went up in August 1961, state media framed it as an anti-fascist protective barrier. Photographs showed barbed wire slicing through neighborhoods, families separated overnight. Later images of Peter Fechter bleeding beneath the wall in 1962 circulated globally. East German authorities tried to control domestic imagery, but West Berlin cameras captured what official language attempted to soften: people trapped between ideologies and concrete. Between 1976 and 1983, Argentina's military dictatorship disappeared thousands of citizens. Official statements denied systematic abductions. Photographs of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, women holding portraits of their missing children, broke that silence. The regime tried to frame them as agitators, but the images were simple and devastating. Empty faces on posters. Absence turned visible. During the Algerian War, images of torture and civilian reprisals were tightly controlled by French authorities. The conflict was officially described as maintaining order. Photographs smuggled to European press contradicted that language. Interrogation rooms destroyed villages. The camera revealed a colonial war the metropole preferred not to see. When North Korea captured the USS Pueblo in 1968, propaganda photographs of the detained American crew were released. The sailors were shown smiling under duress. Later images revealed subtle gestures, middle fingers disguised in staged photos. Both sides used imagery strategically. The same photograph served two narratives: humiliation and defiance. Images of executions and bombed civilians during the Spanish Civil War circulated unevenly. Both Republican and nationalist sides accused the other of fabrication. The debate itself showed the power of photography. If a photograph must be discredited, it already threatens the narrative. In 1956, Soviet tanks entered Budapest to crush a popular uprising. Official Soviet coverage minimized resistance. Photographs taken by foreign correspondents showed armed civilians, destroyed trams, bodies in the streets. These images shaped Western understanding of the Cold War more than speeches ever did. When the killing fields of Cambodia were uncovered, mass graves and skulls became photographic evidence. The regime had attempted to erase records and destroy traces. The images that remained did not require commentary. They transformed numbers into physical reality. During World War I, governments tightly controlled battlefield photography. Early images emphasized bravery and discipline. Graphic photos of mutilation and trench death were often restricted. Britain even passed the Defense of the Realm Act to regulate reporting. The public saw heroism. The camera, when allowed closer, revealed mud, infection, and mechanized slaughter. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. government restricted publication of photographs showing returning coffins. Officials feared visible casualties would erode support. When such images appeared, they humanized loss in a way battlefield maps never could. The war was no longer distant jungle operations. It was arriving home in wooden boxes. During Guatemala's Civil War, indigenous villages were destroyed in counterinsurgency campaigns. Reporting was dangerous, photography even more so. Years later, exhumations revealed mass graves. The delayed images transformed rumors into documented atrocity. Silence had lasted decades. The photographs ended it. After September 11th, thousands of photographs were published. But some, like The Falling Man, sparked intense debate. Should such images be shown? Do they honor victims or exploit tragedy? Editorial decisions shaped collective memory. What we remember is not only what happened, it is what was allowed to circulate. In the 2000s and 10s, satellite images began revealing large detention facilities in Xinjiang. Access for journalists was restricted. Official statements described vocational centers. Analysts compared construction patterns, fencing, watchtowers. In the digital era, photography expanded into orbit. Even when ground cameras are blocked, images can still emerge from above. During the Arab Spring, smartphones replaced traditional photojournalists. Governments attempted internet shutdowns and media blackouts. Yet images of crowds in Tahrir Square spread globally within minutes. In the digital era, censorship moved from confiscating film to blocking bandwidth. The struggle over images did not disappear. It evolved. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers exposed years of hidden decisions about the Vietnam War. Though primarily documents, the headlines themselves became images. Front pages declaring contradiction between public statements and private reality. The lesson endures. Power does not only control territory, it attempts to control perception. And perception begins with what we are allowed to see.